Okay, well, welcome back to Our Nation This Week online. My name is Faitine Grzeski with the News Forum. Right now, I have with me K.R. Davidson. He is a former police officer, now a lawyer, also has a master's in business as well. K.R., let's unpack this first of all. Let's start with the Quarantine Act, people coming into Canada, mandatory quarantine. Unpack the implications for us.
Yeah, we've had something unofficially in play. From a political perspective, there's been a request for individuals that are entering the country to self-quarantine. But the health minister today indicated that there's going to be an enforcement under the Quarantine Act, which is a federal piece of legislation, which would require any individual that's traveling into the country to isolate and quarantine themselves for a period of 14 days. The distinguishment of having this imposed under the Quarantine Act rather than that of being a voluntary act is that it will be enforceable by way of law enforcement. We've seen just this last weekend in the province of Quebec, somebody was actually arrested under their provincial piece of legislation for violating the terms of a quarantine order in that respect. So it seems like they're using all mechanisms available to ensure that there's some sort of restriction on the spread for those that are at least entering the country.
So you're a former police officer. How in the world would they monitor this? You know, you've got Joe and Jack walking down the street. How do you know which one just came back from Croatia?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from what I'm seeing through the federal government's website and such, I believe that most of these entrants are coming in through specified airports that have, and so they'll be given orders and notices. I think in some form or fashion they'll be tracking in that respect, but for all intents and purposes, I think that members of the community may be reporting. So it could be members of an individual's family calling the police or otherwise. It appeared for the incident in Quebec over the weekend that the police were notified and then responded in that respect. I don't think that we're in a place where the police are going to be tracking every person's name at this juncture that enters the country.
Okay, now the health minister, Minister Hadji, said that it was probably about a week ago now, or maybe 5 days ago. It's a bit of a blur. Everything's moving so fast. That if people don't comply with these regulations, at that point they were just suggestions, that greater levels of enforcement would be employed. Do you think it could get even more dogmatic than where we're at right now?
Well, I think that this is what we're seeing here by the federal minister bringing an order in council with respect to the enforcement under the Quarantine Act. You're now seeing the power that's available under that piece of legislation, which will be able to be enforced. So unlike the Emergencies Act for the federal government, which seems to have very small fines, the Quarantine Act has some pretty significant fines. We're taking a look if it's convicted on an indictable offense, a fine of $1 million, not more than $1 million in terms of imprisonment for 3 years. Those are pretty hefty fines in that respect. So it seems like it has some teeth. And then, of course, it'll be a federal piece of legislation. It will be arrestable. And I think that the police will be able to take the appropriate enforcement steps to be able to deal with whatever's necessary in that respect.
Okay, and just so for our viewers who might not be tracking what's happening with this legislation, where is it at in the system right now?
Well, the legislation has been in place. The question is whether there was an order in council essentially requiring that new entrants of the company into the country comply with it. And so that's what the minister is bringing in place at midnight tonight. So I looked at the last time the legislation was amended, it was 2005. So it appears that there was some sort of probably follow up to SARS or such, where they ensured that the requisite legislation was in place in the event that something like that happened again. And so it wasn't as if they just brought this legislation in. This legislation has been in place for some time.
Okay, now let's talk about the provinces. You know, some of the territories closing their borders. I know there was rumblings about other provinces as well. Unpack this as it implicates the provinces and travel domestically.
Yeah, I think that there was some question of whether the federal government could or would step in to have a bar to interprovincial travel. The way that the Constitution is set up in Canada, there's a lot of power that's bestowed upon the provinces, and we can see that all provinces now, including Nova Scotia, as of this last weekend, have invoked a state of emergency, and they're now relying on their legislation, which gives them emergency powers. And so there appears that there's great coordination in Canada between the federal government and the premiers, and the provincial governments appear to have the requisite legislation in place to be able to deal with the issues on a day-by-day basis. In Ontario, obviously, we've just seen recently the Schedule 2 of essential services and all businesses that are required to be shut down. And again, we see some pretty hefty fines for any persons that are in charge of a business that don't comply with that. And so I think I think what we're seeing with reference to the Emergency Powers Act, the Premier is able to make judgment calls of a short-term nature, and then they're recognized by way of order in council. And then there's points where that can be revisited at the future. And, you know, if it goes long enough, then it has to go to the Assembly for recognition of that, those constraints.
Okay. Now I'm going to put you on the spot here with some breaking news. C-13 passed through the House of Commons last night, through the night, late sitting, received royal assent by the Senate already within like 24 hours. And this is the Canada's Emergency Response Benefits Act, or the act that triggered this. $82 billion being given to Canadians and Canadian businesses, $72 billion in direct funding, $55 billion in tax deferrals. Could be pushing us up to a $100 billion deficit this year. Your take on all this? I know something's necessary to help Canadians right now. It's important that we band together, that we pull together. What are the long-term implications of this from your business master's perspective?
Well, you know, I think there's a couple of things that need to be balanced in this respect. The markets are going to be taking a look at how the governments are responding to things. Is there sufficient stimulus to be able to allow the economy to keep moving? And in these times, they're looking at the government as the real vehicle to allow for those injections. So I think one of the things to take a look at is how's the market responding to these news? Because obviously the market's been hit quite significantly. On the flip side, the government has to be responsible with respect to how they're dealing with the distribution of these funds, because there's going to be long-term consequences for the taxpayers. This is not a small amount of money. I think in some form or fashion, there's been a question of whether the government was doing enough. Was there enough stimulus? And I think in this juncture, everybody's addressing things by a day-by-day basis and sometimes an hour-by-hour basis. And so this is a big injection. So I would look to the markets to see how things are panning out, and then we need to take a look at what the details say to see how responsible this distribution is.
Now, from a law enforcement side or from an economic perspective, any ideas that you're not seeing implemented that you think should be by the government, either federally or provincially?
Yeah. Right now, it's interesting. When I looked at the list of essential businesses, I saw that there was, as much as there's a restriction on business, there's still a lot of operation of businesses out there. So I think that there's this balance between how do we keep the economy going, and how do we make sure that we're in this place to safeguard and protect the people with respect to the spread of COVID-19. And so I believe that there's a balancing act that's occurring across the board. I think what we're seeing in this respect, whereby if we continue to see the spread, we'll probably see a little bit more of a restriction with what is labeled an essential service, because I think it's pretty liberal right now, and I think it's trying to navigate that balancing act. So in that respect, I believe that we've seen a lot of the restriction of the large gatherings. I think that there's been greater emphasis now to those individuals that may voluntarily not be abiding by it. I think there's been some strong political statements as of late. And I think the government is probably walking a fine line where they don't want to unnecessarily infringe on the freedoms that Canadians have, but at the same time make sure that Canadians are safe. If you take a look at the emergency power legislation, for example, in Ontario, and I suspect it's the same in other provinces, one of the core components in the legislation is that the government or the premier, and it would be in this case, complies with the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. So there's a balancing act that they're definitely having to navigate in this time.
Okay, well, KR Davidson, thank you so much for your time today. One last question. Predictions. How long do you think it's going to be until we get back to normal life?
Well, you're asking a lawyer here. We don't usually go out on the edge like that. I think that we're hopeful that everybody will come in together, and we'll see in a few months that we'll start to get some sense of normalcy again. That's my take. I think everybody's working hard towards that.
Yeah, well, I think so. With Mr. Morneau basically giving an aid package for about 4 months, that seems to be about the range. Hopefully people are preparing that way. Again, thank you so much, KR, for being with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.